Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. It's becoming a bidding war. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to come back to, in my response to this part of the bill, come back part 3 to the statements that the Minister made at the beginning of his contribution. And he stated that his primary point he wanted to make around part 3 was that we needed to create a culture change within workplaces, that we needed every worker to feel engaged in workplace health and safety. Now, that somehow was his rationale for why we needed to exclude a certain sector of businesses from these provisions. And yet, what is it about small businesses that means that culture change won't be achieved if we have health and safety reps that doesn't apply to larger sized businesses? You know, of course, culture change, but no one's really going to argue with that. But your notion, the Minister's notion that that was a rationale really doesn't stand. In fact, if anything, it felt almost contradictory to say, actually, in the larger workplaces, we see this as a conduit for creating greater workplace health and safety, but we see it as a barrier for small businesses. I would be happy for the Minister to stand up and explain again if I missed the point you were the Minister was trying to make, but I personally saw it as not really a fair and reasonable point. I do want to delve a little bit into the exemptions that sit within Part 3, because we do have an exclusion here for that applies to small businesses, and as has been pointed out by Jan Logie, that's a significant proportion of workplaces in New Zealand. Well, over 90%, in fact, 41% of the new jobs that were created last year were created in businesses that will now be exempt from some of these provisions. Now, I want to delve into some of the rationale for those exemptions and how they might apply. But before I do, the one thing I do want to say is that in my role as small business spokesperson for the Labour Party, one of the strong messages I consistently hear, yes, that was a plug, Chris Bishop, one of the consistent messages that I hear when talking to small businesses is, if you're going to regulate us, make it consistent and make it clear. And in some cases, carve-outs can be unhelpful things. When you have different rules applying, particularly when there are penalty regimes attached, when a business who might be exempt one day employs an extra part-time worker and is not exempt the next, sometimes that can actually do more harm than good. And if that is the primary reason that the National Party is falling back on exemptions, is to be seen as the saviour of small business, I think that's pretty weak. In fact, I actually think that as it stands, there is no reason to give that exemption because of the way that this part is structured. It is primarily driven by what the workers see as need. And if the workers suggest that that is that they want reps, then obviously there is a need there. And if they do that within a small business, that should be particularly compelling as a reason to prompt having a rep. So the option exists. Why create a blanket carve-out where you move away from an option to actually creating a ban? That's essentially what we see instead, which seems crazy from my perspective. So coming to Part 3, Clause 1 states, a worker who carries out work for a business or undertaking may notify the PCBU, the boss, that the worker wishes one or more health and safety representatives to be elected to represent workers. Okay, that's the first way that you can initiate having an election of a health and safety work. A worker initiates. Clause 2 in subpart 3 then says a PCBU, the boss, may on their own initiative initiate the election. So that's the second way. So basically what we're seeing is that if need is identified within that workplace, there are 2 trigger points there that are available. But it says a PCBU is not required to initiate the election of one or more health and safety reps if the work of the business or undertaking A, is carried out by fewer than 20 workers, and B, is not within the scope of any high-risk sector or industry. Coming back to the Minister's point, if there is a culture of health and safety within a workplace that everyone has adopted and that is functioning well, you're probably, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair. Oh, you said my name, thank you. I was probably shouting over you. It's probably,
and this should change, doesn't it?
it's probably unlikely that workers would see a need to trigger the election of a health and safety rep. On the flip side, if your workplace is as small as 20 employees or less, or fewer, and you feel like you need to trigger the election of a health and safety rep, that actually probably points to there being some issues in the workplace. And why would we want to exempt workers from having that right and having that ability? Now, the Minister's fallback position here in 3B is that there will, by regulation, be a list of workplaces where that carve-out will not apply. Now, I have some concerns here. The Minister talked about there being no correlation between health and safety reps and workplace safety.
None that I could find.
That he can find. I would be really interested if he's found then any correlation between smaller workplaces being safer than larger workplaces, because this is a very arbitrary line in the sand that is being drawn. Now, the Minister has tried to counter that by saying, well, we'll carve out the ones that we think are high risk, but how do you define that? Now, the indication that we've had is that an indicative list of high-risk industries will be based on roughly 3 categories. The Minister can correct me if I'm incorrect here. Businesses that carries the risk of a catastrophic event causing multiple fatalities. What is the definition of catastrophic? Sudden great damage is one of the definitions. Examples that you will find if you choose to look up a dictionary, which in committee stages I have quite a in favour of. Well, if you look up a dictionary, you will find the definition of catastrophic usually uses references to natural disasters, fatalities from earthquakes, or things like failures of dams. Things that actually probably are unlikely to be, well, outside of a natural disaster, a small workplace. So catastrophic events, perhaps you might conclude small mining operations, perhaps if you work in pyrotechnics or explosives. But I think it's fair to say this is a reasonably narrow. The use of the word catastrophic would be a narrowing provision in any indicative list. The second category, if the Minister wants to find another definition in the dictionary, he'd be welcome to. The second category, any industry with a fatality rate greater than 25 per 100,000 workers, although we are excluding agriculture, which has,
not over 20.
but still has a significant rate of injury and fatality, and any industry with a serious injury rate of more than 25 per 1,000 workers. My concern with the serious injury rate, absolutely right, as my colleague Claire Curran points out, what is the definition of serious injury? If, for instance, we use the definition used in corrections, it's whether or not you're hospitalised for 24 hours or more. That is significant. To be hospitalised for 24 hours or more these days, you basically wouldn't consider having a baby serious under that provision with the way that we send women packing from our hospitals. So, if that definition is what we're using, that also requires the recording of serious injuries. Now, I don't know, I admit, I don't know the area well enough to know the depth of data that we have, but particularly I'd be interested in what data collection there is around serious injuries in small businesses and in smaller workplaces, because do we really have a handle on some of those areas of industry? Is our data collection robust enough to really make that the provision on which we are excluding those industries? Mr. Chair, the same arguments apply, I believe, to health and safety committees. Again, the provision there is if 5 or more workers in that workplace trigger that provision. If a quarter of a small business say we need a health and safety committee, you've got a big problem on your hands. That's the kind of workplace that needs the ability to have those committees. Why would we ban that as this bill does? It's wrong. The exclusion should be removed, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
The time has come for me to report